What's up guys, my name's Brandon, and before I got my 2019 MacBook Pro 16-inch, I was using my 2011 MacBook Pro for pretty much everything. Web browsing, video editing, photo editing, even some light gaming. Basically anytime I was on the go, I was using this 2011 MacBook Pro all the way up until the beginning of 2020. And surprisingly, it was still performing just fine a whopping 9 years later. So in this video, I wanted to talk to you guys about how a 2011 MacBook Pro runs in 2020 and if you should consider buying one since they are insanely cheap these days, and also if you should hold on to yours if you still have one right now. So this is the base model early 2011 MacBook Pro, which has a 2.3 gigahertz i5 processor and 8 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM. Now every 2011 MacBook Pro actually came with 4 gigabytes of RAM, but of course I did double that to 8 gigabytes later on down the road with some third-party RAM, of course, because it's so much cheaper than Apple's RAM. But it also has a 5400 RPM 320 gigabyte hard drive and an Intel HD Graphics 3000 graphics card with 512 megabytes of dedicated memory. So clearly these specs are weak, obviously, but back in 2011, this thing performed like a beast and was much faster than the previous generation MacBook Pro. But even in 2020, you'd be surprised at just how well this thing performs, especially if you upgrade that hard drive to an SSD, and I'm going to talk about that later on in this video. Now we are stuck on macOS Sierra since that is the last software update that was compatible with the 2011 MacBook Pro, and there are workarounds to get later versions of macOS on this guy, but you do run the risk of bricking your machine, and plus the performance and the GPU aren't going to be quite as good. Now macOS Sierra does run fine and it's stable and everything, but of course I do hate being stuck on that old software version because that means that applications that I paid a lot of money for also are not able to be updated, like Final Cut Pro and Motion, for example. So you're not going to be able to transfer, newer Final Cut libraries over to this 2011 MacBook Pro and pick up where you left off. If you have, say, like a newer iMac, like I did, I tried to transfer, Final Cut library from my 2017 iMac to my 2011 MacBook Pro, and obviously, the Final Cut version on my iMac was a lot newer than the one on the MacBook, so I was not able to, continue working on that project, which was unfortunate. But the reality is, if you're looking to buy a 2011 MacBook Pro in 2020, you're not going to be editing 4K videos in Final Cut Pro or using Photoshop to edit 8K images. You're most likely going to be using it, or at least wanting it, because it's cheap and it's going to get basic tasks done like web browsing, schoolwork, or even some light photo or video editing. Now, before we dive too deep into the internals and everything that this machine does well, let's take a look at the design and the display on this guy. So 2011 was a beautiful time when Apple actually included a lot of ports on the MacBook. So if we flip it over on the left-hand side here, we have the first generation MagSafe connector, which I still to this day love and wish the MacBooks kept. We have the Ethernet port, a FireWire 800 port, a Thunderbolt 1 port. We have two USB 2.0 ports, an SD card slot, which is big for a lot of people that do creative work, and of course the headphone jack. And we do also have the battery status indicator down here as well. On the flip side, we have a Kensington lock slot and a slot loading super drive. So if you have like CDs or anything like that, you can also put them in there and watch the content or maybe play an old game if you want to. And on the front, we do of course have a sleep wake indicator and an IR receiver. And when we open the MacBook up, you do get the glowing Apple logo right there, which I absolutely love. That is a classic. I wish it was still in today's machines. Even on the iMac, I wish it was on the iMac. I wish every Apple product had the glowing Apple logo. It's so cool. It's such an iconic look. I really miss it. And going back to this 2011 MacBook, it really makes me realize how much I like that really small detail. But taking a look at the keyboard and the keys here, you will see a big difference compared to today's MacBooks in terms of, how everything's laid out. So we do have a dedicated power button up in the top right, and we do have that butterfly keyboard, which I've had absolutely no issues with in nearly a decade. So I did spill water on it a few years back and knocked out some of the lighting. So it's basically a partially backlit keyboard now and not a fully backlit keyboard. We do also have a microphone up in the top left and a tiny trackpad compared to today's trackpads down near the bottom right here. And I will say that this trackpad has held up extremely well over time. It still clicks as if it were brand new. It still clicks perfectly fine. It doesn't stick or anything like that. And that's even after very heavy use, when I used to use this as my main device. As for the display, we have a 13.3 inch LED backlit screen with a resolution of 1280 by 800. And that of course is surrounded by these big black ugly bezels. And of course we do have the FaceTime camera there as well, which is nothing special. And going back to that display, watching videos and Netflix shows on this 2011 MacBook Pro is fine. I mean, it's not going to be anything that's going to blow you away with the quality or anything like that. It's not a Retina display. Again, it only has a 1280 by 800 display. But once again, all of this should be expected from such an old machine. And most of you aren't even going to be trying to watch like 8K films or, even 4K films on this MacBook. As far as the sound goes, it's also okay. It's nothing that's going to blow you away, but the stereo speakers sound perfectly fine. Although most of the time when watching a video or a movie, I personally just use a pair of wired headphones with that headphone jack. Now, one of the big reasons that you may consider the 2011 MacBook Pro in 2020 is to get schoolwork done. So maybe you're in high school, you're in college, and you need a cheap but reliable laptop that has enough power to run things like the Microsoft Office suite and Photoshop. And that's where I say that it makes a lot of sense to go with this machine because it can still run all of the Microsoft Office suite perfectly fine with no issues. Photoshop also runs just fine, although you will be limited as to the version you can run. You can see here I'm running, it looks like Photoshop CC 2015, which I believe is the last supported version, so just keep that in mind. And even Final Cut Pro and Premiere Pro run just fine on this MacBook, although you should only edit 1080p clips and not 4K. When I did try to edit 4K video, it was a nightmare. I would get the beach ball like every 3 seconds, and it took forever to attempt to edit a 5-minute video. So keep that in mind. But 1080p clips will be just fine. I used this machine to edit hundreds of videos over the years, and it did just fine. It wasn't the fastest, to render and export out videos, but it did get the job done, and I didn't have to go out and spend thousands of dollars on another machine to edit and export. Now, one thing that I will suggest doing to this MacBook is swapping out that hard drive for an SSD and also adding additional RAM if you get one with less than 8 gigabytes. Upgrading the hard drive is something that I personally never did, and everything still ran perfectly fine for me. But if you do upgrade to an SSD, not only will everything run much faster and smoother, but the laptop also won't be as loud and get as hot as it does. It does get pretty hot, just I guess the thermal inside. That's why it's kind of loud too if you're doing things like Photoshop and doing a lot of multitasking, but most of the time you shouldn't really attempt that with this because it is going to bog down and slow down. So, and I have a hard drive as well, so it's a little bit different. Again, if you have the SSD, that's going to improve pretty much everything about the computer. And you can get an SSD and some RAM sticks combined for like 120 bucks, and they're both super easy to install yourself. There are videos all over YouTube showing you how to install those. They make it really, really easy. Apple made it really easy back in the day, unlike they do now. Now, as far as the boot up goes, that is pretty slow, especially compared to, how fast we're used to everything booting up nowadays. But of course, if you do get the SSD, that will improve your boot up speeds. Of course, eliminate any kind of login items as well that will improve your boot up speeds. But honestly, for the price, you're not going to be complaining about something like that, especially since most people don't usually shut down their laptops every day. So it's not going to be like an everyday occurrence of you having to boot up your device. But even without an SSD or additional RAM, web browsing is flawless on this laptop still in 2020. I use Google Chrome and everything runs perfectly fine, just like it does on my 2019 MacBook Pro. Now, of course, I can't open near as many tabs without lag as I can on my 2019, but when I have just a couple of tabs open, maybe like 2 or 3 tabs, things are nice and smooth on this 2011. Now, as for the overall body of the MacBook Pro, I did use a black shell on it from day one, so it's still in pretty much mint condition except for some things like in the front side right here, which is nice. And the screen doesn't really have any noticeable scratches, maybe some minor scratches, despite a lot of touching and cleaning throughout the years. Now, I did notice that it's pretty hard to clean off the fingerprints and the few, I guess, spit or liquid spots, like the little spots on there that may have been on the screen for a long time. So be prepared to use some kind of screen, cleaning liquid when it comes to cleaning the screen if you do get a secondhand unit that does have lots of smudging on the screen. Now, as far as battery life goes, battery life just really isn't good at all. I mean, at least not on my machine. Mine is still completely stock aside from the RAM, so it does have the original battery inside, and I can still use it without being plugged in, but it only lasts about an hour before I'm running to find a cord to plug it in. I also noticed that it sometimes dies around 20% of battery remaining, which does usually indicate that the battery is bad and needs replacing. But of course, this is another thing that you can replace yourself pretty easily for under $100. But if you're going to always be near an outlet, this is not going to be a big deal to you. Like me, I was personally pretty much always plugged in near an outlet. Even if I was on the plane, I was plugged in, so I didn't really have to deal with that too much. So now let's discuss the price and if you should buy one of these 2011 MacBook Pros almost a decade later. So on eBay or any used market, you can find the 2011 MacBook Pros for around $150, or you could do what I would suggest and get one where the owner has already installed an SSD and additional RAM. So those are going for closer to $200 to $225. And for that price, I say that it is absolutely worth it if you fit the criteria that I've mentioned throughout this video. So it's a great laptop for schoolwork like the Microsoft Office Suite and Photoshop, and it's even good for some light video editing with Final Cut Pro or Premiere Pro, and all for $200, which once again is a great price given the laptops, the price of the laptops on the market right now for $200, and of course the price of the newer MacBooks, which are well more than that. And let's not forget that the amount of ports on this guy are also just another reason that this laptop still holds value for some people. So you're not going to need a dongle, you're not going to need a hub or anything like that when you're using it, because it has basically every port you could want. So it's just a solid $200 laptop that's going to knock out daily tasks and web browsing with ease. So yeah, that's pretty much it for my review here on the 2011 MacBook Pro in 2020. Let me know what you guys think of the 2011 MacBook Pro. Do you have one? Are you looking to buy one or maybe replace an iPad or an older MacBook? Let me know all your thoughts down in the comment section below. And if you guys enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you give it a thumbs up. And of course, make sure to subscribe so you see more videos like this. But anyways, guys, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.